This was a really complex research project. We had many, in a sense, masters that we had to satisfy. As I said at the beginning, this was a project that had as its goal to design and then to evaluate a school-based program that would address HIV risk and hopefully reduce the risk of sexual transmission, in particular of HIV, among young people. The funding agency, DFID, or Department for International Development, was very interested in numbers and statistics. How many young people? At what age do they initiate sexual activity? How many partners do they have? What percentage use condoms, et cetera, et cetera? What are their attitudes? What do they know? So there was most definitely a quantitative component to the research project. So young people filled out surveys. Teachers also filled out surveys about what they taught, how often, etc. But to get at scripts and how sex happens, you can't just ask who and how many and when things happen. You need young people to tell the story of how sex happens. And there we relied on focus groups where young people could talk together and we could understand how they were responding to each other. So one would start with a particular how things happen story and another one would add to it, and then, oh yes, but that's not allowed, and yes, this is, and I know other people. So you would get an understanding of how young people speak about sexuality to each other. And then in-depth interviews, our third method, where we would then interview a particular young person about their own personal experiences in the area of sexuality. And then finally, we used observations. We had research assistants who lived in the community and who would report their observations on scenarios, settings, situations, or circumstances that the young people had spoken about in their focus groups. So many of them spoke about when the market comes to town, and this is where people hook up or connect. Or they would talk about instances in school and how people connect for relationships in schools. So then the observations in those settings would help flesh it all out so that we had a better understanding. So our four main methods were surveys, focus groups, in-depth interviews, and observations. Using several methods together present specific challenges or unique challenges. Sometimes the results you get or what seems to be coming from your data seems to contradict each other. I'll give one example. We had a series of questions that examined young people's knowledge about how HIV is transmitted, also whether they endorsed certain myths about HIV transmission. And those focused on sexual transmission because that's what our program was going to focus on. They scored terribly. It was rare for a young person to get more than half of the questions correct. So that would be a 50% score, really just barely, maybe not passing, maybe passing. And we thought, oh my, this means that they need a lot of information about how HIV is transmitted. But in focus groups, in-depth interviews, first of all, is where we got our first insight that a lot of the young people we interviewed really had good knowledge about how HIV was transmitted. So we were curious. In focus groups, in addition, what we learned was that not only did they have good knowledge, but they could challenge each other if someone didn't have correct knowledge. So we had our interviewers explore that more. Explore so that when a young person would give a correct answer, they'd say, well, is that always the situation? Well, what we found is that very quickly, young people put many conditions on their, quote, correct answers. So if asked, a typical question in a questionnaire around HIV would be about whether condoms can prevent transmission of HIV. Well, they would say, yes, they can, but the problem with condoms is that either they're hard to get, or the condoms that we get break often, or you can't always get your partner to use a condom, or then you have to figure out how to carry a condom so that other people don't know, especially for girls, because if someone sees a girl carrying a condom, they immediately assume that she's easy, she's loose, and she gets a bad reputation. So we'd say, so can condoms help prevent transmission of HIV. Well, they can, but they don't really work because of all of those reasons. So what we were getting, what we figured out was what we were getting in those questionnaires was they would sit there and they would say yes, but not really for us. So they'd give us a no. Whereas in the interviews, they could provide us with all those explanations for why they would say no. They had the knowledge, they knew, but they also knew the conditions under which they lived and why something that could work, should work, and on paper will work, but in their life circumstances wouldn't work. So the challenge of using multiple methods, and actually the benefit of using multiple methods, is that quite often you can clarify what appears to be the case from one method with what you learned from another method, and you get a much fuller set of information. So that in that instance around condoms, what we learned was that in talking about condoms, in teaching, in working in the school about condoms, all those conditions surrounding difficulties with condom use became the most important message.